Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion about how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting the families of infants and toddlers across New York State. My name is Ian Rosenblum, and I'm the Executive Director of the EdTrust-New York, a nonprofit policy and advocacy organization committed to educational equity, and a member of the Raising New York coalition that is hosting this press conference. Raising New York is a diverse statewide coalition of parent, early childhood, education, civil rights, business, and health organizations dedicated to increasing the number of children who are on track for school readiness. We know that before this pandemic, it was difficult for many families of color and families from low-income backgrounds to find affordable, accessible, and high-quality early learning experiences. What we feared was how much this crisis would exacerbate these existing inequities. The poll we will share today is intended to shine a light on the lived experience of parents of young children during this crisis, and particularly the experience of New York's most vulnerable families. Unfortunately, the poll demonstrates that our worst fears were correct, and that families that were historically underserved during so-called normal times are being disproportionately impacted during this crisis. Families are struggling to meet the fundamental needs of their children in areas including food and financial security, childcare, health and emotional well-being, and the enriching, engaging, and developmentally appropriate activities that will help them thrive in school and beyond. It's clear that the inequities that already exist for infants and toddlers will end up being even worse after this crisis. However, we can also use this moment to address the needs that were already evident before and that are even more urgent now, in order to make New York State the best place in the country to have and raise a child. To support this work, we're pleased to share these poll results. The statewide survey of parents with children ages 0 to 3 was conducted by Global Strategy Group from April 18th to 22nd. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some logistics. You'll hear from several members of the Raising New York Steering Committee, which groups are shown here on the screen, who will review the findings of the poll. All participants will be placed on mute during the presentation. If you have a question, please post it using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address as many as possible after the speakers. If you experience any technical difficulties, please email Tiffany Lankes at TLANKES@edtrustny.org. And as always, we are happy to take follow-up questions after the event, and we'll do our best to help you tell this important story to your audience. To start off, it is my pleasure to introduce Sheena Wright, President and Chief Executive Officer of the United Way of New York City.
Hi, I think I'm unmuted, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ian. And United Way of New York City is really proud and pleased to be a part of this important group. We are an organization that works at the intersection of the corporate sector, government, and nonprofits. And our primary focus is really helping low-income New Yorkers achieve a level of self-sufficiency. And I think this survey is so important because, as Ian says, it gives voice to so much data and statistics that we see, but we really need to hear and understand those lived experiences so that we can do what we need to do in terms of advancing the mission for low-income New Yorkers. And just a little context here, you know, one of the key findings is that New York parents of infants and toddlers are experiencing intense financial insecurity at this time. I think it's important to know before COVID, 40% of New York households, New York City's households, were below self-sufficiency, and there were similar challenges across the state. And if households with children were experiencing some of the most income inadequacy, and certainly households of color the most. And I think now with COVID, where we are looking at a possible 20 to 30% unemployment rate, that is going to deepen, and particularly for families with children. One of the first things to go is food. So many families are really reducing their food. Job loss and fear of job loss is certainly what we're feeling, and it's being experienced by families with parents of infants and toddlers. In the survey, 34% have already had their hours or pay reduced. I imagine that that number is even higher now, and 67% are worried about losing their jobs or having their hours reduced. More than half of parents and infants and toddlers are uneasy about their personal finances. So the stress and strain and real challenge of really trying to make ends meet certainly is being experienced by families with children, infants and toddlers significantly. The next slide. And 1 in 3 parents of infants and toddlers are skipping or reducing meals. As I said, when people are feeling a financial crunch, the first thing to go is food. And the campaign against hunger actually had some data that came out that said child hunger has more than doubled since the coronavirus crisis has hit. And the next slide tells a little bit about the behaviors. What happens first is that parents themselves skip or reduce their meals. And you'll see almost 50% of furloughed workers have skipped or reduced their own meals. And once you've exhausted every option and opportunity, you also will not be able to provide food for your children. And we've also seen a significant increase in demand in emergency food programs and a contraction of availability of food. So people are really feeling that significantly. In addition, the coronavirus crisis has been incredibly disruptive in terms of families of children, infants, and toddlers' well-being. There is a lot of worry and stress around mental health. There's huge disruption in the home and family life. There's significant worry about their children's social, emotional, and cognitive development. And the challenges around substance abuse and domestic violence, the worry there is significant as well. More than 3 in 4 of the parents of young children are experiencing higher levels of stress. And what's so challenging is we understand the impacts of stress not only on mental health, but on physical health. And this is obviously a disease that attacks those that are most vulnerable. So this is a real concern. And then another challenge is just the unavailability of services that families have certainly depended on. 1 in 3 parents of infants and toddlers who rely on early intervention, early Head Start, and home visitation programs that have been essential, really crucial, particularly for new parents to receive services and supports, are not getting them. Half of those surveys said that they weren't given the option. 32% did not even really appreciate how it would benefit their children. It's very difficult to figure out how to do these things in a digital world. 11% were given the option, but didn't have the technology. And there's a significant digital divide in low-income communities, and particularly communities of color. And then 10% were given the option, but there wasn't an adult in the household that really could participate in those sessions, which is a requirement. Next slide.
Thank you, Sheena. Our next presenter is Heather Berschetti, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Business Council of New York State and a co-chair of the Raising New York Coalition. Heather?
Hi, good afternoon, and Ian, thank you for having me. The Business Council is a proud partner in Raising New York, and we are always, even prior to the pandemic, have been very concerned about access to childcare as being something that makes it difficult for employers and employees to navigate the work day. But since the coronavirus outbreak, the childcare landscape for infants and toddlers has dramatically shifted. There is a lot of uncertainty about childcare for many parents of young children in New York, including among essential workers. So just to give you an idea, before the pandemic, 41% of families relied on family or center-based childcare providers, and 42% had at least one parent staying home to care for their child. Now, only 5% say their childcare daycare program is open and that their child or children are still attending, and 80% now have at least one parent at home. Most parents of infants and toddlers say that if their current childcare situation that they say is only somewhat workable or not workable at all. And I think people are very uncertain about childcare arrangements and what will happen when the crisis ends. How will childcare centers function? And more than half who rely on family childcare providers and childcare centers expect that they're going to need additional support to help their children return. This obviously proposes a huge impact and a threat for businesses and the workforce, as if we didn't have enough that we're facing already, but it is an important component of getting back to what is going to be our new normal. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to back to Ian, and I apologize in advance. I do have a hard stop at 2:30.
Thank you, Heather. And our next speaker is Dee Dee Hill, the Director of Policy at the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy.
Advocacy is thrilled to be part of this event and the Raising New York Coalition. Thrilled to be working together with all of our partners to elevate the needs of the youngest New Yorkers. The Schuyler Center is a statewide nonprofit dedicated to advancing policy that strengthens the public systems that serve disenfranchised populations and people living in poverty, particularly New York children and families. My role today is to discuss some of the action steps that New York, in partnership with federal and local government, should take to support and ensure the well-being of New York families with young children as we navigate this public health crisis. And before I get started, there are a few important frames. First, while no one is immune to COVID-19, due to longstanding structural inequities, the pandemic is having disproportionately severe impacts on communities of color, Latino and other immigrant communities, and low-income communities. This reality has to be top of mind as we craft solutions, particularly given the scarcity of state and local resources. And some additional context that's already been alluded to, but I want to underscore that even before the pandemic, 20% of young New York children and their families lived in poverty, and 40% lived in near poverty. So already they were one missed paycheck away from real financial disaster. And this is due in part to underinvestment in essential supports for families with young children, like childcare, home visiting, refundable tax credits. Looking ahead, we hope that state leaders will keep this in mind as they make budget adjustments. Across the board cuts will disproportionately hurt families with young children. So I'm going to now highlight some of the urgent assistance New York families with young children need right now to help them weather this crisis, as was revealed in the survey responses. First, families with young children need financial assistance. As Heather noted, many respondents have already been laid off from work or have had their hours reduced. And unfortunately, the economic modeling suggests more are going to follow. New York has to ensure that parents of young children are receiving the financial support that they need to cover their basic needs and to ensure they don't fall deeper into poverty. New York has a special obligation to the many immigrants that are residents of New York, many of whom are serving on the front lines as essential workers, keeping New York running and our communities safe. Many immigrants have been excluded from federal stimulus checks, from unemployment benefits. We have to ensure that these families are not left behind. Second, our families with young children, they need food security. Our survey results revealed that this is a tremendous problem touching too many of our families. They need additional support. Third, families with young children need access to health, wellness, and support professionals. They also need emergency supports. A third of parents who responded to the survey say that they have missed health appointments for their child due to the coronavirus. New York has taken some important steps to ensure doctors are fairly reimbursed for telemedicine, but we need to build on those steps. We need to expand telehealth services, particularly ensure that there's access to early intervention services, to home visiting. We also need to ensure that families have access to technology and broadband so that they can access these important health services. Finally, our families are experiencing tremendous stress right now, the stress of isolation, the stress of uncertainty. We need to make sure that all families have access to mobile crisis supports. And key to this is all families need to have access to broadband internet. They need the technology to hook up to the internet. And we have to remember that there are many families that don't have access to transportation. So we have to make sure that they are connected to the services they need. So in closing, while it's not possible to overstate the challenges facing families with young children in this moment, as we move into the rebuilding phase, there is opportunity. Already New York and the federal government have pivoted to fill in some longstanding gaps in health coverage, in sick and family leave, in unemployment insurance, in access to technology and telehealth. So let's build on these innovations so that New York and New York families can emerge from this pandemic stronger than ever. And with that, I'll kick it back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Our final speaker before we move to questions is Melody Baker, the chair of the Erie Niagara Birth to Eat Coalition and a co-chair of the Raising New York Coalition. Melody?
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Ian, for that introduction. And thank you for this opportunity to raise awareness on these important and very critical issues. As Ian introduced, I'm the Director of Education at United Way, Buffalo Erie County. And as an organization, we are dedicated to the health and the well-being of our community. We are closely monitoring the COVID-19 pandemic and taking steps to minimize the impact of the outbreak. We are thrilled to be a part of this important work and how and everything that has been taking place. Many of these data points underscore what many of us already realize is a troubling reality of the pandemic, that families who are historically underserved during so-called normal times are being disproportionately impacted when it comes to food insecurity, access to resources, and maintaining health and well-being during this crisis. It's heartbreaking to think 70 years after the Civil Rights Movement, we're still fighting for the most basic human rights: access to food, health, economic stability, and education for all. My fear is that once this is over, we'll go back to our regular daily lives and forget what uncertainty and discontentment feels like. If there was ever a time that we need to turn our attention to supporting all of New York's children and families, it's now. I certainly hope that this survey will ignite a sense of urgency and change for policymakers, and they can do that with greater investments in early childhood programming moving forward. So support for expanding access to quality, affordable childcare and preschool for New York families with young children is incredibly high among parents of young children at 92%. As the state recovers from the devastating impact of the crisis and looks to reimagine the role of government in supporting New Yorkers, 83% of parents of young children also agree that the state should be doing more to ensure infants and toddlers in New York are healthy and developmentally on track at birth and throughout early childhood. Thank you again, Ian. Thank you, Raising New York. Thank you, everyone who has been listening to these very important issues.
Thank you, Melody. We are going to open it up for questions, and as we do, we welcome two more of our colleagues from the Raising New York Steering Committee, Jen Roja, who leads the Child Care Council of Suffolk County, and Kate Breslin from the Schuyler Center, who is also a co-chair of Raising New York. As we give you a few moments to enter any question in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, we are reminded again of some of the really troubling themes that came out of this survey, particularly around financial insecurity, the devastating impact of food insecurity, and parents' concerns about their children's development. And so we have on the screen here two of the quotes from parents who responded to open-ended questions that were among the survey questions, and how they framed the fears and concerns that they have for their families and their children. So we'll wait a moment and invite you again to ask any questions in the Q&A, and then we will try to respond. And as you do, I will start to answer a couple of the questions. So first question asks how many parents were surveyed. The survey again was conducted by Global Strategy Group. It included 402 parents of children ages 0 to 3 throughout the state, and it had a confidence interval of plus or minus 4.9%. Second question, the geographic distribution of the parents surveyed, and are there any important regional differences given that the crisis is more severe in New York City? The survey is geographically representative and representative by income as well. New York City in the data is clearly the most intensely affected. The New York City downstate suburbs are particularly uneasy about finances as well, we found, but doing slightly better than New York City. And then the effects are slightly less, again, upstate, although obviously clearly high levels of stress among parents, impacts of financial insecurity, and other challenges that families are facing. There is a question about whether we've reached out to state lawmakers or anyone from the governor's office about these concerns and what they can do, and if so, how are those conversations gone? I'll turn it over to a colleague in a moment, and I would just say that it's really important, as we've talked about this, to recognize that these are state issues and federal issues and local issues. One of the key needs that we have here is increased federal investment through the next stimulus, which is important for many of the issues that have been raised here, in particular food insecurity and helping to ensure that the child care system is ready for the economy to reopen. And let me turn it over to my colleague Jen as well.
Hi, thank you, Ian. I think just to echo that point, that we absolutely need significant federal support in order to respond to all of these issues. Specifically on childcare, there has been an allocation from the federal government to the state for childcare to respond to the COVID crisis. The state is rolling that out slowly. Right now, there is $30 million allocated statewide to help essential workers afford childcare. So if you are income eligible, you can get free childcare right now if you are an essential worker. And we are hoping that much more will be done both in the immediate term and also planning for the reopening. And I think the economic development councils will also be playing a critical role in this, working with the governor and with our legislators.
Next question, could someone talk about the effects on education in rural communities, specifically regarding internet and technology access? I'll open it up in a moment. I just wanted to mention a couple of the highlights from the poll, although not specifically rural, speak to those concerns about technology. So 91% of parents of infants and toddlers said that it would be helpful to provide free online resources to use with their children. Only 29% said that that's a resource that they currently have access to. 91% said that it would be helpful to provide free or increased internet access to families. Only 20% said that they are currently receiving that free or increased internet access. And likewise, 91% said that it would be helpful to provide access to their child's doctor via telehealth technology through a computer or tablet, and only 17% said that that's a resource that they have. Those were among the very high needs of parents and the really significant gaps between what parents say would be helpful and what is currently being provided to them in terms of technology. And let me see if any of my colleagues would like to add any comments.
Hi, Ian. Yes, I did want to say that the rural community, even before the pandemic, has had some great challenges with access to quality internet and broadband services. So I know that this pandemic has just exacerbated the issue, unfortunately. So, and even many of the schools, we just looked at some of the trends across the districts. More of the rural communities don't have the iPads, don't have the devices that the schools have given out. So that's been a real challenge and a real concern. Something that we're very worried about, especially once this is over, because needless to say that the gaps are going to be devastating between the haves and the have-nots.
Thank you, Melody. Next question, where does the state budget and CARES Act and other federal emergency aid come into play? I think we are all deeply concerned about the potential impact of state budget cuts, and that's why it's so important to fight for additional federal investment through more stimulus allocations for critical things like addressing food insecurity specifically, as well as, again, thinking about the future of affordable, high-quality childcare. Jen, would you like to add?
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to add, and I think it's really echoing what Dee Dee and Sheena said, is that we had significant budget challenges in these programs prior to the pandemic. And so when we talk about additional cuts to our safety net, to our schools, it's really frightening to see what will happen when we know so many were already left behind. And so, you know, the CARES Act funding that we've received as a state is a small mandate and is not even close to what we need to address these inequities. And so I just think it's important, again, to highlight that we started from a place of a deficit before we even hit the pandemic.
Yeah, this is.
I think that's really. Go ahead,
I wanted
Kate.
to just kind of amplify that. I think we need now to be looking to the federal government, you know, now more than ever in some ways, in part because our state government can't print money. I think we need to be doing advocacy at the state level, certainly. And so, yeah, we need to be making sure that our congressional representatives and people in Washington understand the significant impact that this is having in New York, and particularly on families with young children. And at the same time, I think it's important to understand that so many of these inequities existed, you know, 6 months ago, 12 months ago. And young families with young children, particularly those with low income, were struggling then. And what the pandemic and its impacts, so, you know, a virus in and of itself doesn't discriminate, but illness does discriminate. It attacks the most vulnerable. And then the repercussions of everything else that's happening are really just driving inequality even more so. And so I know there's a question, kind of a connected question on the table relating to local governments. I mean, those local governments with in some cases, the least capacity to raise their own revenue are going to be among those that are the hardest hit. And so we need to really be thinking about at all levels. Unfortunately, there's no one solution. So we need to be kind of looking at all levels of government, and at the same time as my colleagues have talked about, at food security, at the digital divide, at health insurance coverage and access. We need to look at it all to help support these families.
And as Kate alluded, there's a final question that asks, what role can municipal governments play now and post-pandemic in addressing pre-existing structural inequities among families with young children? I'll ask if any of my colleagues would like to start off on that one.
Well, I'll start by saying one of the things, and this is actually kind of flipping the question around a little, is that we need to make sure that our state government isn't driving additional inequity by pushing things down to municipalities that often have little ability to raise revenue. So I think I want to start there by, there were some proposals, for example, in the budget that was recently passed that would have kind of tried to shift costs to local government when in fact that exacerbates inequities.
There's a couple items from the poll that I think also are really important here in terms of the municipal role in outreach and making sure that local residents are aware of what is available to them. And so 90% of parents said that it would be helpful to have meals that parents can pick up in their communities or have delivered to their homes. Only 26% of parents said that that was currently available to them. 87% of parents said that it would be helpful to be connected to resources that can help with food, housing, employment, health, and other needs. And only 14% said that that's available to them. In fact, many more parents could have access to those resources, but too often are not given the information or the ease of enrollment or access, or there is not linguistically appropriate outreach in partnership with community-based organizations, and particularly community-based organizations that serve immigrant communities to provide those services. And so that is a critical role at all levels of government, and certainly the municipal role. Melody, were you going to add?
Yeah, so I was going to add, considering municipal governments, I think that it's going to be very important that that we not just think about now, but we be very proactive in, number one, making sure that we double down on the resources. I know that there are not a lot of resources considering everything that has occurred, but really making sure that we prioritize the families that we know will have, who are most highly at risk. I think it's very important that we really think about this as an opportunity to rethink how we do a lot of things, how we support childcare, how we're focusing on the most important things, not the most difficult things as it relates to early childhood education. So I think that this is a great opportunity. However, I do want municipal governments to be proactive and really think 3 months out, 6 months out, how will this crisis affect our most vulnerable populations, and then go on from there.
Yeah, and this is Sheena, just to expand on that a little bit more. There is absolutely a need for municipal governments to be much more focused and much more strategic and prioritizing whatever limited resources are available. Not only the city, the state, the federal government, because I think part of the challenge is not just that people are not aware, is that there is a delay actually in making sure that these resources and services are available. When we think about the rollout of technology for families, you got that if you were already registered and had an email address kind of with the DOE. There should have been some focus, not all these weeks down the line, to say, the majority of low-income parents with small children are not in the directory. I think another example, just kind of egregious, is just the testing. We know that the neighborhoods and communities that have the most underlying conditions, are still kind of waiting for testing centers, just getting them these many weeks after. But so that's, unfortunately, we can't keep doing that. And so certainly around these issues and making sure that there's focused strategic interventions that are prioritized for this community is going to be a priority at every level.
Thank you, Sheena, and thank you everyone for participating in this event. I'd just like to remind you that if you have additional questions or would like additional information, please email Tiffany Lankus and she will connect you to the right person among the Raising New York Steering Committee. You'll also be receiving the press release and additional resources from this poll findings, and they will also be available on the Raising New York website. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everybody.